Welcome one and all. Thank you for those who have come out especially this evening to spend some time with us reflecting with Reverend Stu Cameron, and also to our Synod members who have had a bit of dinner and returned to be here as well. We had some plenary time with Stu this morning, which was Stu promised that he's going to dig a little bit deeper and reflect more widely from a theological perspective. As many of us know, Stu, he's one of us in many ways, regardless of actually being in Queensland for so many years and now in Sydney, but we still own him as one of us. He still barracks for a South Australian football team. And you Port supporters, be nice to him. Stu was ordained, and for those who read New Times, you can read the greater level of detail, but 2004, Coromandel Valley Uniting Church. He was our General Secretary for a number of years. He went to Queensland to lead what was then Robina Uniting Church, which was then renamed to be New Life. And how many years, Stu? 15 years. And now he finds himself in Sydney, and with Sue as well, and as the CEO and Superintendent of Wesley Mission, and that's been since 2021. So, Stu, it's amazing to actually see how God has led and guided him and the influence of his ministry from when he was here, his ministry pre-ordination, his ministry as General Secretary, and then in pastoring in Queensland, and now as a leader of Wesley Mission. We are so privileged to have you with us, Stu, and I know you are going to go to the showdown tomorrow, and may it go well for you. I'm only just being generous, people. I barrack for neither of those teams. So, Stu, we actually really do value you, your family, and the way in which you have given yourself so freely in your ministry, and how you have also been able to advocate, particularly on issues such as gambling reform. And so we are so delighted that you are here, and I invite you now to come and lead us. And from this point on, Stu even said, don't bother about coming up for Q&A, I can manage it, moderator.
No, I did not say that. Thank you very much, moderator. It is fantastic to be with you, and just so grateful and honoured that you would come out on a Friday night. It's a big ask, and particularly for those of you who are Synod members, after a long day yesterday, and I know more ahead tomorrow, that you would come out and give time to what I think is just such an essential topic for us to wrestle with as Australians, but also as Christians. And the opportunity we have in this moment to speak and act prophetically. I really believe there's a Kairos moment, as I said this morning. Moderator, General Secretary, thank you so much for your invitation. I do count it as a real privilege, and it is coming home. Let me be really clear. This, and you'll hear a bit more of that in my talk tonight, but who I am and the ministry that God has opened up for us over the last 20 or so years. It's been more than 20 years since we've lived in South Australia, which is quite amazing to us. But the adventure that we've been on, it was shaped by the formative years we have had here and the opportunities that we were blessed with, and many people in this room, many people in this room, which is just such an enormous blessing. Before I kick off, a couple of things. First and most importantly, I want to acknowledge that we are on Kaurna country, and I want to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. And at Wesley Mission, we're on a journey towards reconciliation. And that has been such a remarkable journey for me personally as well. We do a lot of work with and alongside First Nations communities across New South Wales, and I have been remarkably blessed by both the wisdom and grace that they have extended to me and to us as we have learned along the way. Tonight, very different for me, partly because of the subject matter, partly because I don't want to keep you here until 10:30. I've actually written this out. I don't normally speak this way, so this is a bit out of my comfort zone. I'm actually going to speak from a manuscript. I want to convey what I want to convey, and I don't want to miss anything, but I also want to be disciplined in how I communicate. About halfway through, I'm going to break for all of our sake. And there'll be a short video, which I'll explain when we come to it, then come back. And then we'll have an opportunity, I hope and pray, for questions and some conversation. So without further ado, let's get underway. So I've always been a reader. I was the kid who, if he didn't have a book in hand at the breakfast table, would read again and again the back of the Weet-Bix packet, intently poring over all the nutritional information. While reading a Weet-Bix packet won't change your life or shape its course, reading books always will. In my early 20s at Happy Valley, where Sue and I were under the ministry of Reverend Nita West, who's here tonight, I read 3 books in quick succession, biographies of 3 giants of the evangelical revival that swept Britain and its empire through the 18th and early 19th centuries. In the 5 or so years leading up to reading these books, caught up in the wave of the charismatic renewal movement that swept through churches in the 1980s and formed by some wonderful leaders in an amazing church at Coromandel Valley, my faith came alive. I had a growing yearning, a clear sense of call to be on mission with Jesus. The 3 biographies I read way back in 1989 helped in shaping and clarifying that call. So what were the stories that gripped me so fiercely? John Wesley, William Wilberforce, and George Whitefield. I still have the books here, and I've read them again and again, and many other books around them. 2 preacher evangelists and a politician, riding a wave of God's Spirit, their lives inextricably linked. Wilberforce, Wesley, and Whitefield shaped the course of history. By any measure, their lives were consequential history-making. And while historians debate how strong their influence and that of others was, they profoundly changed, for the better, the spiritual, social and political landscape of Britain and beyond. So inspired by reading these books and a freshly minted graduate accountant, I began to explore how I might begin to express my faith both in and beyond the walls of the church. I read more. Jim Wallace, the founder of Sojourners, and closer to home, Athol Gill, the Baptist activist and theologian and one of the founders of Melbourne's House of the Gentle Bunyip. Tony Campolo's writing, and especially his preaching, man, that guy could spit, inspired me with a vision of evangelical faith that expressed itself spiritually and politically through social activism and the pursuit of justice. My rapidly growing faith could best be described then and now, it has to be said. I haven't changed a lot, perhaps grown a little, as evangelical, socially and politically engaged with a charismatic twist. For a brief period, I joined the Labor Party, thinking party politics could be a forum I could express my expanding vision of faith. But then I discovered Labor branch meetings were even duller than church meetings, and my membership lapsed. Sorry, moderator, I'm sure it's not the case here. But the seed planted by those books continued to germinate in my spirit. How might God use me to make an impact on my world in my time? As much as Wilberforce and Whitefield changed Britain, there's another group of leaders, their names less well known, who it can be argued had an even greater impact. The group included Wilberforce and rode the waves of the same evangelical awakening into the early 19th century, just when colonial Australia was laying its foundations, and this is really important. The small group of mostly Church of England members, a loose affiliation of friends, met together in the London suburb of Clapham. Becoming known as the Clapham sect, they played a pivotal role in the abolition of slavery, prison reform, education reform, political reform, and the establishment of the British and Foreign Bible Society and the Church Missionary Society, CMS. It was an astonishingly fruitful legacy. One biographer summarised the impact of the Clapham sect on their time and place. The ethos of the Clapham became the spirit of the age. Clapham was a collaborative movement that had a massive kingdom impact. The Clapham sect comprised women and men and included business leaders, clergy, politicians, philanthropists and academics. Driven by a shared faith, they pooled their extensive resources, diverse skills and their extensive political reach in seeking nothing less than to reform British society through the application of biblical values. Empowered by God's Spirit, they were a collaborative, multiplying movement who generated exponential impact. While Wesley, Wilberforce and Whitefield were some of the so-called great men of history, the Clapham sect was a great movement in history. Wesley, Wilberforce, Whitefield, the Clapham sect. Now, borrowing from 20th century historian David Bebbington, they all shared four essential commitments: biblicism, crucicentrism, conversionism, activism, a high view of Scripture as the foundational and ultimate authority for faith and theology, a central focus, an obsessive focus on the saving and atoning work of Jesus crucified and risen, a belief that faith is to be expressed through experience and a commitment to the gospel, the conviction that as ambassadors for Christ, faith must be expressed through evangelism and social activism. A biblically rooted, Jesus-glorifying, passionate and practical faith. Now, the waves of the British evangelical awakening crashed onto Australia's shores in 1812 when four Wesleyan immigrants, one still a convict, formed the first Methodist community. In 1819, they built the first Methodist chapel in Sydney town. Tellingly, as I said this morning, in the same year they built that first chapel, they built a homeless shelter that could accommodate hundreds. Passionate and practical faith. It's this cloud of witnesses, spiritual activists and entrepreneurs that inspire and challenge me, and I hope us, to settle for nothing less than a biblically faithful, Christ-proclaiming, disciple-making, socially and politically active faith. Through various seasons of Wesley Mission's 200-plus year history, we date our history back to 1812. We've engaged in social activism, sometimes more visibly. Many of you know of the story and the witness of one of my predecessors, Alan Walker. Fruitful evangelist, radical pacifist, prolific author, media commentator and fierce advocate for the marginalised, he was famously referred to by Bill Hayden as the conscience of the nation. It's reported that such was his influence, political leaders would ask aides what Mr. Walker thought before deciding a way forward on any contentious matter. When I arrived at Wesley Mission a little over 5 years ago, our prophetic voice had quietened a little. We take a lot of money from the government. Don't bite the hand that feeds you. And through a strategic planning process, we identified reclaiming our prophetic voice as one of our four key strategic priorities for the 5 years ahead. And gambling reform emerged as one of the three advocacy priorities we would lend our voice to. Well, why? Well, 5 reasons. First, we have extensive, decades-long experience supporting those who've experienced gambling harm. Poker machines were first legally activated in New South Wales on the 19th of September 1956, 70 years ago this coming September. Leading up to their legislation, Alan Walker prophetically warned the Labor government, there's a familiarity about this as we go along, of the potential devastating consequences on families and individuals. For 40 years or so, pokies were to be found exclusively in New South Wales clubs. Then in the mid-90s, under great pressure, the Carr Labor government allowed pubs up to 30 machines. An avalanche of harm has eventuated profit-motivated pub barons fine-tuning their business model of ripping as much money out of punters' pockets as possible. It was through Alan Walker's leadership that Wesley Mission founded the Lifeline movement in 1963. I live in the manse where he took the call and when they had the prayer meetings that formed that amazing ministry. In the 1990s, our Lifeline crisis responders noticed how many callers were experiencing gambling harm. This led to establishing the first dedicated gambling counselling service in Australia. Then we established Australia's first dedicated legal aid program serving people whose lives had been devastated by addiction. And today, we operate New South Wales 24/7 Gamble-Aware Helpline and are the largest provider of gambling counselling and education services in the state. In other words, we hear the stories and walk alongside countless gambling harm victim survivors. That's the first and perhaps the most important reason. Second, the sheer magnitude and reach of gambling harm in our community. There's not a postcode or demographic that's not impacted. New South Wales is the epicentre of that gambling harm, not just in Australia, but the world. We serve at Wesley Mission more than 100,000 vulnerable and marginalised Australians every year, and time again we hear how gambling harm is a major, if not the major contributor to other harms, including suicidal ideation, domestic and family violence and homelessness, just to name a terrible few. Third, why gambling reform? As I will articulate more fully later, the biblical call to God's people to do justice requires us to speak. Some of the most courageous people I know are those with lived experience of gambling harm who share their stories in advocating for reform. And you saw some of those and you heard about some of those this morning. But the sad reality is that the overwhelming majority of those who experience harm do so in silence and in shame. The scriptures call us to speak up for those who cannot speak for themselves, for the rights of all who are destitute. Speak up and judge fairly. Defend the rights of the poor and the needy. Fourth, Wesley Mission is an evangelical church and community services organisation comprising 2,000 staff and 8 congregations. It's wild. Our collective mission, church and community services together, is to continue the work of Jesus Christ in word and deed. We are a spirit-led disciple-making movement doing all the good we can because every life matters. Along with preaching the gospel with the hope that individuals surrender their lives to the gracious love of Jesus, crucified and risen, advocating for gambling reform for justice is continuing the work of Jesus in word and deed. Gambling reform, finally enacted, will be a tangible and real sign of the inbreaking kingdom of God, the reign of God. And there's a fifth reason why we and I are involved in gambling reform. Because like most Australians, like many of you in this room, I know and love someone who in the past experienced gambling harm. 21% of Australians are impacted by gambling harm, either through their own gambling activity or the activity of a loved one. This is personal for many of us. Now, let's turn for a moment to the extent and reach of gambling harm in Australia. Strap yourselves in for an avalanche of stats. As a recovering accountant, I love this. Here we go. Australia's gold medal for gambling harm. Walter Misner said that gambling is a sure way of getting nothing for something. And it seems like Australia's missed the memo. According to comprehensive data compiled by the Queensland Audit Office, Australia lost almost $32 billion to gambling in the 2023 financial year. That $32 billion loss is represented in this waterfall chart, showing half of those losses to poker machines, with a further $9 billion and rapidly growing loss to wagering, the majority of it online. This year, that will be north of $40 billion by the time the stats come in. When it comes to losses per capita, it's Australia first and daylight second. Here's the per adult losses for the world, accounting for the fact that over 1 in 3 adults in Australia do not gamble. as you can see here, the average loss per adult in Australia in 2022 was just north of $1,600. Accounting for the fact that 1 in 3 adults in Australia do not gamble at all, the average loss increases to $2,492 for Australian adults who do gamble. What's scary about these figures is the growth of gambling losses. Rather than slowing, it's accelerating, far outstripping the rate of inflation, in fact more than double. New South Wales makes up half of Australia's poker machine losses. Of that $16 billion back in 2023, $8 billion was in New South Wales. This year will be over $10 billion. This year, those losses are growing 9.4% year on year, more than twice the inflation rate, and the fastest rate of growth since the pandemic. It's not slowing down, it's just speeding up. Perhaps in this cost of living crisis, people so desperate are chasing their losses. Online wagering grew a staggering 62% in the 3 years up to 2023. 62% in 3 years. This chart, and these 3 charts I showed this morning, this chart shows the growth in Australia's gambling losses from 1980 onwards, demonstrating acceleration points, including the introduction of pokies into New South Wales pubs in the mid-90s and the post-COVID sports betting spike. That's what that's all about. All of this is happening in the midst of an inflationary cost of living crunch. We all know about that. Gambling is, it has to be said, a recession-proof industry that does not bow to any cost of living pressures. Between 2019 and 2023, this is where I'm going to get really a bit of a policy economic wonk. Between 2019 and 2023, real Australian wages adjusted for inflation actually dropped by 5.7%. If you think, I don't seem to have enough money to spend or as much as I did in the past, that's real. We might have more money, but it buys less. Over the same period, gambling expenditure adjusted for inflation grew by 6.8%. So we have less money in our pocket, but we're spending more of that less money on gambling. Second, public health catastrophe. I describe myself, as I said before, as a recovering accountant. I'm comfortable around facts and figures, charts and graphs. When it comes to Australia's gambling addiction, it's easy to get lost in the numbers, in the stats. But the numbers tell a terrible story, not simply how much money is being lost to gambling in our country, but the epidemic of harm that's been caused. Gambling harm is causing a public health catastrophe in Australia, one that touches every postcode, age demographic, cultural group and community. So what's the scale of the crisis? A New South Wales Government Commission report, and I've referenced this already, shows that in our state, and the stats might be a little less here in South Australia, but not too much, an almost incomprehensible 1 in 5 New South Wales residents, that's about 1.8 million people, have been impacted by gambling harm, either through their own gambling activity or that of a loved one. It's said that gambling harm is a family disease. One person might be addicted, but the whole family suffers. Even if we don't fall into that 20%, most of us will know someone whose life has been upended by gambling addiction. So who's most at risk of gambling harm in Australia? The research says First Nations communities. Called communities are particularly vulnerable to gambling harm, as are Australians without a tertiary education. Overall, men are more at risk of gambling harm than women. Young men aged 18 to 24 are almost twice at risk of gambling harm than any other age group. This chart shows the increases and decreases in the prevalence of betting between 2015 and 2022. By age group and gender. And what you'll see is the huge spike in gambling activity for young men in particular. As I said, behind the eye-watering gambling loss numbers is an avalanche of harm, including financial harm, mental health, emotional health, relationship impacts, and the impacts of work on work and physical health. Financial harm, loss of assets, drained savings, maxing out credit cards and accumulating insurmountable debt. basic needs deprivation, redirecting essential household money away from food, rent or bills, economic ruin, job loss, bankruptcy and potential involvement in fraud or theft to fund the addiction. Our legal aid service was established to help people who got themselves into a terrible mess through their gambling addiction. Mental and emotional health, psychological distress, feeling of intense guilt, shame, worthlessness and helplessness, co-occurring disorders, high rates of severe anxiety, depression and substance misuse. Suicide risk, individuals experiencing gambling disorder face a substantially elevated risk of suicidal ideation. Relationships impact, conflict and breakdown, family violence, the impact on kids, work and physical health, poor performance, sleep disturbances, insomnia, physical stress responses stemming from gambling-related anxiety. It's a miserable list. And this personal misery has a communal price tag. In short, the gambling industry does nothing to contribute to our economic life, rather it drains it. The Victorian Responsible Gambling Fund has commissioned 2 reports into the social costs of gambling in that state, both conducted by Central Queensland University researchers. Taking a robust public health approach, the report found that the cost of gambling to the Victorian economy in the 2023 financial year was $14.1 billion. More than half of that cost was attributed to poker machines. Now, this chart shows the breakdown of costs, including lost savings, productivity, mental health distress, crime, and so on. The same year that the gambling cost the Victorian community $14.1 billion to gambling, the Victorian government received just $2.5 billion in gambling taxes. In other words, the cost to the economy of gambling was more than 5 times the benefit the government received through taxation. Now, if the South Australian government here is receiving just south of $500 million in gambling tax, you would say that's costing this economy in South Australia around $3 billion. It doesn't make sense economically. Last year, Wesley Mission and the Alliance for Gambling Reform commissioned a report written by Equity Economics on gambling and the cost of living crisis. Amongst its many shocking findings are that Australians lose more to gambling, wait for this, Australians lose more to gambling than the federal government spends on aged care, and almost as much as is currently being expended on the NDIS scheme. That's a staggering thing. The report also found that Australian households, on average, lose just over $3,000 to gambling, which is $200 more than they spend on household utilities like gas and electricity. The burden of gambling harm is borne disproportionately by those who can least afford it. Australia's gambling industry is cynical, exploitative, and misery-making. It's unjust. It's also a major contributor to Australia's growing inequality gap. Let me offer some stark examples from my home state. Every 3 months, New South Wales Liquor and Gaming publish raw poker machine loss data. Wesley Mission analyses and summarises the data in quarterly reports, noting trends. And frankly, it's Groundhog Day. Every time it's up and to the right. And I do interview after interview saying the same thing. We have an epidemic of harm happening in our state and the government sits on its hands and does nothing. The most obvious and shocking is that the most socially disadvantaged communities in our state lose the most. It'd be the same here. The average loss per person to poker machines in the 3 months from January to March across New South Wales, every man, woman and child in just 3 months in New South Wales was $276. The Fairfield local government area in southwest Sydney is statistically the most socially disadvantaged of New South Wales' 118 council regions. It's a community with a large proportion of called, refugee and First Nations populations. In the first 3 months of 2026, across 90 days, $186 million was lost to poker machines in that one council area in 3 months. We reckon by 2028, in just Fairfield Council, they'll lose $1 billion to poker machines every year, which is as much as the whole state of South Australia right now. But if in New South Wales, people are losing $276 on average to poker machines, that average in Fairfield is $892, the most socially disadvantaged community in our state, more than 3 times the state average. The highest per capita poker machine losses are concentrated in the poorest and most vulnerable communities, and it's no accident. One of Australia's youngest billionaires is a man, this is where I'm going to get a bit personal. One of Australia's youngest billionaires is Sam Arnaud, having accumulated an estimated $3 billion. Just check out the AFR. He owns trophy homes in and around Sydney Harbour, including an apartment he bought for $22 million back in 2017. If you've been to Circular Quay, the toaster building there. Last month, he sold his Manly holiday home for more than $20 million. Why would you need a holiday home when you live at Circular Quay? I don't get it, but anyway. Arnaud owns pubs. He doesn't own pubs on the North Shore where I live, or the Northern Beaches, or down at Bondi. He owns multiple pokies pubs, the overwhelming majority in working class and poor suburbs and towns, including in Alice Springs and in Cabramatta, the heart of Fairfield. This is Cabramatta Hotel. Pubs in New South Wales can hold a maximum of 30 poker machine licences. Based on official government stats and gaming industry intelligence, this one pub earns around $20 million in gross profit every year on its 30 poker machines. That's around $650,000 per machine. Pokies are reverse ATMs, more often taking money from the pockets of those who can least afford it and transferring it to the pockets of wealthy pub barons, multimillionaires and billionaires who live on the North Shore, from the western and southwestern suburbs of Sydney to the eastern and northern suburbs of the same city. It's Fairfield and Bankstown and other regions in west and southwest Sydney that disproportionately experience gambling harm. Here in Adelaide, that'll be the cities of Playford and Noarlunga. It's profoundly unjust and inequitable, and it should get us, let me use a technical term, cranky. It's scandalous. One more example. The Bankstown Sports Club in Western Sydney is big. When I say big, it's really big. It has 745 poker machines on its gaming floor. It's not a club, it's a casino. If it looks like a duck, walks like a duck, quacks like a duck, it's a duck. Bankstown Sports Club is located directly opposite the Bankstown Public School, primary school, which is home to 720 primary school kids. In other words, there are more poker machines in that venue than there are primary school kids in the school opposite. The club earned 70% of its revenue from its 745 poker machines. Last year, that was a gross profit of $104 million. Meaning that across the year, a staggering, when you multiply it out, a staggering $1 billion or more was put through its machines. There's also an unholy alliance of interests. There's an unholy alliance of vested interests that for decades have thwarted every attempt to rein in gambling harm in Australia. When it comes to poker machines, the clubs and pubs industry, especially peak bodies like Clubs New South Wales or the AHA, Australian Hotels Association, have had politicians of all stripes either in their pocket or cowering in the corner. In 2010, Prime Minister Julia Gillard formed a minority government with the support of independent Andrew Wilkie, a passionate gambling reform advocate, and he still is. In return for his support, Gillard committed to legislating the mandatory introduction of pre-commitment cashless technology for Australia's poker machines. The backlash was fierce and fast, with Clubs New South Wales mounting a highly visible, well-funded and sophisticated seat-by-seat pre-election Save Our Clubs campaign. It had Labor quickly running scared. Labor saw poker machine reform as electoral kryptonite, and tragically, it still does. As soon as former Speaker Peter Slipper pledged his support for the Gillard government, straight away the reform commitment and Andrew Wilkie were dropped. The impact of the brutal politics of the club industry on Labor politicians has left its scars. Just 2 weeks ago, I was told by a senior Labor Party leader close to the Prime Minister that it still makes Labor reluctant to do anything that would upset the gambling industry. Since the Gillard government clashed with clubs, and I say this as someone who has always leaned and voted centre-left politically, Labor across the nation has cozied up to clubs and pubs industry and now to the online sports betting industry, taking their donations, taking meetings with their phalanx of lobbyists and resisting any real reform. If I'm in Canberra or I'm in Macquarie Street, the clubs, pubs and online sports betting lobbyists are there in the corridors all the time. In New South Wales, Labor-affiliated clubs that donate directly back to the party's electoral coffers operate 110 machines. In the ACT, 4 Labor clubs operate more than 430 machines. When it comes to online betting, the links are even more pervasive and wide-ranging. First, there's the major sporting codes, most especially the AFL and NRL. Each take a commission. Now, you may not know this, but all the sports betting ads, and they're so annoying, aren't they? But for every bet that's placed, both the AFL and NRL earn a commission of between 1.2% and 1.5% on every bet placed. So if someone bets $100, $1.20, $1.50 goes back to the AFL or NRL, earning somewhere between $40 and $60 million a year for each of those codes. Then there's the lucrative sponsorships on top of that. The AFL has a $100 million sponsorship, 7-year, $100 million sponsorship with Sportsbet, and the NRL earns around $15 million a year from its betting partners. Then there's the TV rights. Peter V'landys, who's the chair of the NRL, just landed today, it's been announced today, a new broadcasting deal for the NRL that's projected to bring $5 billion, or around $650 million a year over 7 years, outpacing the AFL. He wanted to beat the AFL. I mean, how can that figure be justified by broadcast partners? 2 reasons. The continued push to push paid content via streaming platforms that you have to pay for, and advertising revenue, especially from sports betting companies who spend around $200 million a year on advertising on legacy media as well as online platforms. We've been told again and again that the main reason the first Albanese government delayed its response to the Murphy inquiry more than 1,000 days was because it feared the pre-election fallout of any commitment to ban or limit gambling advertising in the key battleground state of WA, where Kerry Stokes owns a TV station, the Perth equivalent of The Advertiser, and radio and other media interests. In other words, he has a monopoly. All legacy media relies on the rivers of gold coming from sports betting companies. Simply put, it seems Albo didn't want to poke the bear. These big numbers underpin the whole sports ecosystem and the media industry that orbits around it. The money flowing from gambling underpinning player payments is one of the reasons clubs can reportedly afford to offer someone like Zach Butters a multi-year $17 million deal. Proliferating platforms and harm. It's not often I agree with the 47th President of the United States. In fact, I can only think of one instance, as I said this morning. It was earlier this year when Donald Trump said that the whole world has, in effect, become a casino. This is from one of the few people on the planet who managed to bankrupt a casino. The world has become a casino. The revolutionary device we have in our pockets and the apps available through it mean that for the first time in history, we can gamble anywhere, anytime, on anything. The whole world has become a casino because we have a casino in our pockets, a dopamine mega factory offering a dizzying array of ways we can lose our money. Currently banned in Australia, platforms like Polymarket allow you, if you have a VPN, you're good to go, allow you to effectively bet on anything. Will the Straits of Hormuz open by the end of the month? You can bet on that. Will Iran's new supreme leader survive the month? You can bet on that. Will Iran's missiles fall on Israel? You can bet on that. You can bet on it all and more, so much more. Let me talk about proportionate gambling reform. Of the $32 billion lost to gambling in 2023, $25 billion was lost to gambling, to pokies and sports wagering, most of it online. So they're the 2 biggies. For Australia to rein in the epidemic of gambling harm we currently experience, both sectors need urgent evidence-based reform. The good news is we have the evidence-based solutions. The not so good news is to date we don't have politicians with the will to enact them. The Murphy Report, You Win Some, You Lose More, tabled 31 unanimous cross-party recommendations shaped by expert opinion and lived experience to reform Australia's online gambling industry. Along with the Alliance for Gambling Reform and other advocates, and with courageous voices on the crossbench, we've continued to agitate for the full implementation of those recommendations, in particular the development of a national strategy, we don't have one, regulation, and a regulator. Regulation of online sports betting is a couple of guys who meet every month up in the Northern Territory, part-time. And for online greater investment in public education, coordination of ongoing research and better data collection of gambling harm data. And of course, a staged and eventual full and comprehensive ban of all gambling-related activity. Now, when it comes to poker machine reform, we know what happens in New South Wales. We've been told this again and again. We won't see gambling reform in Victoria, in South Australia, in Tasmania. All have made steps in the past towards it, but until New South Wales does it, it won't happen. It's the belly of the beast. And what happens in New South Wales will eventually spill over into other states. 4 years ago, we launched our Put Pokies in Their Place campaign. You can find out more about that campaign. That slide will come up in just a moment via the QR code on the screen. Wesley Mission's Put Pokies in Their Place campaign has 5 asks of the New South Wales Government. The big 3 are these. 1, the introduction of mandatory universal identity-linked cashless payment system with harm minimisation measures like loss limits, breaks in play, pre-commitments, all built in, all of which is independently administered. In other words, take cash out. The technology to make this possible is ready and available in use in Melbourne's Crown Casino, where carded play is mandatory because they were naughty boys and girls, and more than 500,000 punters have dutifully signed up. 2, poker machines are turned off between midnight and 10 a.m. Harm increases. I couldn't believe on Pulteney Street you can go and play a pokey at 5 o'clock in the morning. 5 o'clock. Poker machines are turned off between midnight and 10 a.m. Harm increases the further into the pre-dawn morning a punter sits in front of a machine. Nothing good happens in a pokies den at 3 a.m. in the morning. 3, with the introduction of account-based gambling, the implementation of an effective statewide exclusion register that empowers gambling harm victim survivors to take real control. It's time to talk about the Bible. The passionate pursuit of gambling reform is nothing less than an expression of biblically faithful Christian discipleship. I love how Archbishop Desmond Tutu puts it. There's nothing more radical, nothing more revolutionary, nothing more subversive against injustice and oppression than the Bible. If you want to keep people subjugated, the last thing you place in their hands is a Bible. Jesus tells a story about a Good Samaritan. An anonymous man is beaten, robbed, and left for dead in a ditch on the lonely road between Jerusalem and Jericho. You know the story. A priest walks by, followed by a Levite, a priestly assistant, and they see the man in his predicament, but without slowing their pace, find reasons to ignore him and his predicament. Then a Samaritan man, despised for his ethnicity, walks the same road, sees the man whose life hangs by a thread, and he has compassion on him. So much compassion, at great risk to himself, he stops and crosses the road, and at great cost he ensures the man's wounds are tended, his needs met, and his life is saved. This, Jesus says, is what it means to love our neighbour as ourselves. Now, Tim Keller invites us to imagine a sequel to the story. We all like a good sequel. Imagine the Samaritan man takes the Jerusalem to Jericho journey regularly, say every week. And every week, every single time he walks those dusty badlands, he notices other victims. In fact, multiple victims, robbed, beaten and left for dead in other ditches dotted along the road. So many victims, even if his compassion has no limits, the Samaritan man's ability to help them does. And he asks himself, why? Why are there so many robbery victims on the Jericho road, and what can be done about it? Martin Luther King Jr. says that, on the one hand, I quote, "On the one hand, we are called to play the Good Samaritan on life's roadside, but that will only be an initial act. One day we must come to see that the whole Jericho road must be transformed so that men and women will not be constantly beaten and robbed as they make their journey on life's highway." Systemic injustice can only be overcome by the transformation of those same systems, the uprooting of the old and the establishment of the new. Put another way, and with real urgency, in one of his early sermons, Dietrich Bonhoeffer said, "We are not simply to bandage the wounds of victims beneath the wheels of injustice, we are to drive a spoke into the wheel itself." Hannah More, a key member of the Clapham sect, was a passionate follower of Jesus. A single woman and comfortably wealthy, she was a teacher, author, and generous philanthropist. Her passionate pursuit of justice, in particular the abolition of slavery and education reform, was an expression of her biblical faithfulness. She said this, "Bible Christianity is what I love, a Christianity practical and pure, which teaches holiness, humility, repentance, and faith in Christ, and which, after summing up all the evangelical graces, declares that the greatest of these is love, is charity." Hannah More, William Wilberforce, and other members of the Clapham sect passionately pursued the abolition of slavery and reform of prisons, education, financial systems, and politics as an expression of their biblical faith. Their efforts embodied God's call to God's people to do justice. For the Clapham sect, God's call to love our neighbour meant dismantling the systems that oppressed them. 4 years ago, we decided at Wesley it was no longer enough to render assistance. We've been doing that since the mid-90s to those experiencing gambling harm, but that God was calling us to seek systemic change that prevents harm in the first place. Our Put Pokies in Their Place campaign now comprises a collaborative and growing network of 60 organisations, unions and Muslim Women's Association, the heads of churches and all sorts. It's a wild bunch. And more than 6,000 additional individual supporters. We're so grateful. It's been a wild, challenging and exhilarating ride ever since. The Clapham sect put their money where their mouth was. Comfortably wealthy, Wilberforce, Moore and others walked the talk of their reform efforts through sacrificial, cheerful generosity. Leading into the New South Wales state election almost 4 years ago, half a dozen philanthropic partners gave collectively just under $1 million to fund a Put Pokies in Their Place advertising campaign that ensured gambling reform was a major election issue for the first time ever in our state's history. One of our generous philanthropic partners continues to fund our 6-monthly community attitude survey and other initiative, ensuring our campaign continues to have momentum. Now, as I said before, Wesley Mission's mission statement is continuing the work of Jesus Christ in word and deed. Pursuing gambling reform is an expression of that mission, proclamation of good news as we seek to dismantle the Jericho road of rampant gambling harm in our state and nation. And I'm constantly reminded that this work is God's, not ours, that the battle belongs to the Lord, not to us. The Clapham sect knew their battles were not with flesh and blood, but with principalities and powers, spiritual forces, and in particular, the gods of money and power. Knowing this, they were fervent in prayer, humbly recognising that without God's help, all their efforts were in vain. On the recommendation of my good friend Claire Steele, CEO of Compassion Australia, I read the biography of a remarkable woman last year, Jesus follower and activist Josephine Butler. Extraordinary. The daughter of Earl Grey, yes, that Earl Grey. In the second half of the 19th century, Butler led a movement that worked tirelessly and in the end successfully for justice for women and for girls. At a time when working class girls were routinely trafficked within and beyond England, when sex workers were forcibly detained simply for suffering an STD, Butler took on patriarchal, Victorian, prudish England and all its classism. Opposition was fierce and nasty, including from some parts of the church. It took many years, but amongst her many victories, Butler and a vast coalition saw the age of consent in England raised from 12 to 16, where it still is to this day. Butler's life was transformed when, as a young person, she had a powerful and mystical encounter with Jesus when living in the Lakes District around Keswick. There's a name that's familiar to us. All through her life, she was a woman of deep prayer. She wrote a biography of Catherine of Siena, that great medieval mystic. A brilliant activist and organiser, a visionary leader, a prolific author, Butler attributed any success she and the movement she led had to the power of prayer. Prayer was not peripheral to her campaigns, but central and around which all else orbited. She wrote, "It's not enough to know the history of great political movements. We must participate in the making of history through prayer." Don't you love that? The further she advanced, the deeper became her prayer life, or more like the other way around. She trusted Jesus with and in everything, knowing that when a believer prays, in your feebleness you hold the hand which governs the universe. After launching our gambling reform campaign, we drew up policy positions, started building our coalition. We reached out to the state government ministers, then to the then Premier and leader of the opposition and media to advance our efforts. We wrote, we emailed, we called, and we heard crickets. Nothing, nada. No one, no decision makers responded. No one, not one. It was dispiriting, to say the least. It was also unsurprising, as the gambling industry had vast political reach, power and resources. Both major political parties had avoided poking the gambling bear for decades for fear of the political consequences. Money, it seemed, drowned out all other voices. Despite our concerted efforts, this silence and this lack of response continued for a year. Then, about a year before the election, it all changed. I interviewed Dom Perrottet, then Premier, at our Easter breakfast, a long tradition at Wesley Mission. A man of deep Catholic faith, I asked him what he was going to do about reforming the gambling industry. We were all expecting a wise and wary politician's non-answer. But he stunned the room when he said he wished the state government, which was receiving more than $2 billion every year in pokies taxes alone, did not, and I quote, earn $1 from the machines. I could literally see his then Chief of Staff, Brand Black, having conniptions in the corner. Roll forward almost a year from that breakfast to February 4, 2023, and it's just under 2 months from the election, and it's one of the most surreal moments of my life. It's 8:30 on a Sunday morning, and I'll be preaching at our 10:30 traditional service in the city. I'm all suited up and ready to go. I'm home on a conference call that will last an hour, which includes Tim Costello, Premier Perrottet, his Chief of Staff, as they seek our feedback on their gambling reform policy, which they announced the next day. It was a pinch me moment. For the first time ever, gambling reform was a major election issue, the public demanding change. The front page of the Sydney Morning Herald the next day put it this way: only God. Only God. For a year, we'd strived to gain traction in our gambling reform efforts, but no one was listening and no one was interested. But in his providence, God opened doors that had been for decades slammed shut. God opened a door that we were able to walk through. In the end, the Perrottet government did surprisingly well in the state election, but was still narrowly defeated. The new Minns government came to office with a hastily, and I have to say, reluctantly shaped gambling reform policy, including the formation of an independent panel on gambling reform. Along with the CEO of NCOS, academics and a person with lived experience, in good faith, we joined the independent panel, along with Clubs New South Wales, AHA CEOs, the Gambling Technology Manufacturing Association, in forming a really weird mob of widely varied views and commitments. Lasting 18 months, I was the member on that from Wesley Mission. It was hard work. Meetings got nasty. We handed the government our report and recommendations, not many of them unanimous, there's a surprise, and insisted on recording our dissenting views where necessary. 18 months ago, we handed in our report, and today we still wait for a response. I'm under an NDA about that. It seems that in New South Wales, as in Canberra, Labor governments are quite happy to kick gambling reform into the long grass. At one point in its history, God's people faced a vast army of the Moabites and Ammonites seeking to destroy them. King Jehoshaphat calls a fast, and he and all of Judah seek after God, and God speaks, "Do not be afraid or discouraged because of this vast army, for the battle is not yours, but God's." As I said, the struggle for justice ultimately is not ours, but God's, and only with prayerful persistence and in God's strength will victory be secured. The wonderful Josephine Butler puts it so well. God himself must bow to meet the evil, must shoulder its deadly weight, grasp in its breadth, its length, its infirmity, and thus, and only thus, conquer it. While often We have been encouraged by a step forward in our gambling reform efforts. It frequently seems to be followed by a step back, sometimes two. By the grace of God, we are learning to be tenacious in persevering in the face of disappointment and opposition, persevering in prayer especially. Last year, we launched Gamble Reform Sunday, where more than 100 churches, including all Hillsong churches across the country, prayed for gambling reform on the last Sunday in October. We would love for you, as per the proposal, to join us in that. The Italian neo-Marxist Antonio Gramsci wrote from his prison cell of the struggle for revolution. He said this: "The challenge of modernity is to live without illusions and without becoming disillusioned. I'm a pessimist because of intelligence, but an optimist because of will." When it comes to gambling reform, facts are our friends. And the facts are that gambling culture is deeply entrenched in Australian society, as is the harm that goes with it. As I said this morning, as my good friend Tim Costello says so eloquently, gambling is to Australia what guns are to America, our cultural blind spot. The forces that resist reform have this year it'll be 40 billion reasons to resist. We cannot delude ourselves at the size of the task, but far more so should we never underestimate the power of our God. No disrespect to Mr. Gramsci, but I am an optimist because I follow a crucified and risen King whose promised return will, to borrow the words of Tolkien, ensure that everything sad in this world will become untrue, every injustice overturned, including the injustices caused by gambling harm. We are on the winning side. Just 8 days before he died, John Wesley wrote to William Wilberforce, who had not long before been elected to Parliament, was in the early stages of building an abolition movement. Wesley knew that Wilberforce and his partners would face enormous opposition. At this time, 80% of Britain's foreign income was derived directly or indirectly through the slave trade. It underpinned the whole economy. For Britain at that time, abolishing the slave trade would have an impact analogous to Australia banning export of iron ore today. Wesley's charge to Wilberforce was this: unless God, 8 days before he died, unless God has raised you up for this very thing, you will be worn out by the opposition of men and devils. But if God be for you, who can be against you? Are all of them stronger than God? Be not weary of well-doing. Go on in the name of God and the power of his might. Most of you know the story. In 1790, Wilberforce introduces his first abolition bill. It failed dismally to gain support. Over the next 17 years, on 10 more occasions, he introduced versions of the same bill. And in 1807, 17 years later, the 12th time he tabled a bill before Parliament, it was carried. While slavery continued, the slave trade was abolished across Britain. 16 years later, in 1833, and just after Wilberforce had died, British slavery itself was abolished. Victory was won after 4 decades of tenacious effort. In 1797, Wilberforce published a book on real Christianity, which became an instant bestseller. Speaking of the tenacity needed to persevere in the face of disappointment, he said, "Accustom yourself to look first to the dreadful consequences of failure. Then fix your eyes on the glorious prize which is before you. And when your strength begins to fail and your spirits are well nigh exhausted, let the animating view rekindle your resolution and call forth in renewed vigour the fainting energies of your soul." They had a way with words, didn't they? Wilberforce and the Clapham sect knew that with God standing with them, who in the end could stand against? A few years ago, I read about some urban activists in San Francisco. One of my favourite stories. Lining the streets of that city are fruit trees, pear, plum and apple trees. City officials concerned about fruit dropping on the ground and attracting rodents and other pests progressively replaced the fruit-bearing trees with sterile ornamental fruit trees, trees that will not bear fruit. In the dead of the night, these activists, they called themselves the guerrilla grafters. You can look it up online. Graft into these sterile tree branches from fruit-bearing trees. The only mark of their work is the tape that holds the branch in place until it becomes part of its host tree. And so eventually dead and sterile trees are brought back to life. I love the motto of the guerrilla grafters. It's this: undoing civilization one branch at a time. In inviting us to participate in his mission, Jesus invites us not to undo civilization so much as to seek its transformation. And we do that best as we faithfully preach and live biblical truth. Keep our eyes fixed on and proclaim Jesus crucified and risen. Continue his work in word and deed, and in his strength participate in his kingdom coming, hope-filled, justice-making ministry of reconciliation and renewal of creation. A few years ago, in an article in The Atlantic, George Packer reflected on Israeli philosopher Gershon Scholom's concept of plastic hours in history. There are in history what you would call plastic hours, the philosopher Gershon Scholem once said, namely crucial moments when it's possible to act. If you move, then something happens. In such moments, an ossified social order suddenly turns pliable, prolonged stasis gives way to motion, and people dare to hope. Plastic hours are rare. They require the right alignment of public opinion, political power, and events, usually a crisis. They depend on social mobilisation and leadership. They can come and go unnoticed or wasted. Nothing happens unless you move. An ossified gambling industry that has perpetuated industrial levels of misery on our nation has, through community anger and divine providence, become pliable, perhaps for the first time. It's gambling reform's plastic hour. We can dare to hope, but nothing will happen unless we embrace this plastic hour and move. As a church, in the Spirit's power, in Jesus' name, and for his glory. Amen. So sorry?
You want to take some questions or take a breath?
I'm conscious of the time, and it went 15 minutes longer than I anticipated, but there's a surprise. But questions?
If we have a microphone, a handheld, or we've still got the aisles. So if you'd like to come and ask a question of Stu, he promises that he'll keep his answers suitably
brief,
proportional to his presentation.
Thank you. Yes. Hey,
Hello.
G'day.
I've known you for a while, Stu.
Yeah, there's a few of you in that room.
Southeast kids, right? So I'm actually going to take you to task. I hope this is okay. That's a long-winded question. You mentioned that now New South Wales has to lead the way. I actually beg to differ. And I just want to state a few things to you. The SA has led the way with the voice to Parliament. SA has led the way with under-16s and access to apps and all of that, and the whole country has taken over. There is actually no reason that SA could not lead in this area at a time where you wouldn't know it via our media, but our government won in an absolute slide. Like you wouldn't know it because a certain other party is getting all the media. But now is perhaps a time for you to get alongside of Peter Malinauskas tomorrow night at the football. And maybe instead of sports in this state, we could lead in another way. I'm just wondering about your thoughts because we could be the leader again.
You know, I accept that rebuke.
And I did want to say there's a lot of great leaders in this room, and maybe you could come home and join them and lead that.
No, look, it's a really well articulated point. And look, in South Australia, for decades, has been a socially progressive, economically progressive state that has led the nation in so many different ways. The message that we've heard from politicians and bureaucrats is that the other states use New South Wales as their excuse not to do anything. Said if they can't do it, we can't. Yeah, it's a poor excuse. And, you know, you all, apparently, you know, everyone's in love with Mally. Well, get alongside him and, you know, well, yeah, please. It's a good idea. You're right.
Not asking you to solve all my pastoral issues, but the other week I had the feedback from a couple of blokes saying they had a poker night And one of them was, I cleaned up really good. And at the time, I felt really weird about it. And I was like, I didn't know that we had a church poker night going on. And then I think hearing what you're saying, I feel even weirder about it. I think there's a lot about the big reform and the big conversations about gambling reform. What can we do in our local context? What are some practical, really small things that we could do, if you have any advice?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. One thing I would say, our line, because I have Reverend in front of, like a lot of people in the room, Reverend in front of, I mean, Tim and I get dismissed as wowsers all the time. We hear it all the time, directly and indirectly. And we say we're not anti-gambling, we're anti-gambling harm. To be really clear, we're not wanting to stop people, because the Prime Minister says, these reform advocates, they want to stop working class people from having fun. No, we want working class people to have fun, we just don't want them to be exploited. So, it's just ridiculous. So I think the message we need, we don't want to put more guilt and shame onto people, but I think education is absolutely key. Education is absolutely key, particularly for our young people. It was ironic, the other day we had a group of North Shore private school kids coming in for I spoke to them, addressed them. And one of them, a 16-year-old kid, had a sports betting app on his phone. So education, particularly for that younger generation, and speaking into it, preach into it. Preach into it. Because there are people in your congregations who have been impacted by gambling harm. Make no mistake. They live with it silently and with shame, and let them know there's help. We always say, there's always help, there's always hope. And we need to be proclaiming that hope and giving opportunities for people to find that hope in practical ways. Education, but also speaking directly into the opportunities for people to find the support they need, I think is really critical. But not putting more shame and guilt on people. Yeah, be my simple advice. Yeah. Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Thank you.
Look, in our working groups today, we were thinking about smoking advertising and how in the 80s and 90s that was just everywhere in sports, and now it's just not. I'm obviously far too young to know any of that story. You made a reference to, thank you, you made a reference to the money being received by state governments pales in comparison to the cost. For smoking, that's really, really obvious, but for gambling, I hadn't considered that part of it. Can you just say a little bit more around that?
Yeah,
and give us maybe like a little thing that I can snip into a sermon at some point?
Yeah, well, in New South Wales, it's $4.1 billion in gaming tax. And the budget was just released, and the forward estimates actually see that growing even faster. That's done by Treasury. So Treasury is saying, we don't believe the government's going to do anything over the next 3 to 4 years. And so that's just going to be accelerating harm. So the biggest addictions are in Macquarie Street and on North Terrace. That's where the biggest addictions are, because this is easy money. You don't have to raise taxes, you just tax clubs and pubs more. It's unseen by most of the community. So I think that would be the first thing, and calling that out. And when state governments are facing really difficult budget challenges, it's really hard to say to them, you need to introduce reform that's going to reduce over time. Because basically the simple equation is to reduce and prevent harm, you need to reduce and prevent the amount of losses, which reduces the amount of gaming tax, unless they tax at a higher rate. So there is a trade-off here. But the cost of that tax, in New South Wales, our estimate based on Victorian research is more than $20 billion. So it's a false economy. So I think, that logically it doesn't stack up. So I'm not sure if I answered your question there, but go back again for a second time.
Those costs are like $20 billion. That's in healthcare. That's
all the public health outcomes, crime, lost productivity.
Cool.
I mean, the Victorian Responsible Gambling Fund did a report in 2017 and 2023, university peer researched. And we're trying to we can't even get that research done in New South Wales because the government doesn't want to know.
Thank you. Thank you.
My question is along the same lines, because I'm old enough to remember smoking in staff rooms. I was a teacher and everybody smoked. And I can remember Julia Gillard stamping that out, so to speak. And I wonder what we can learn from that campaign, from the anti-smoking campaign and the spectacular results. What can we learn from that to address the gambling issue?
Yeah, I think what we're learning is grassroots wins every time. So we're going council by council in New South Wales, getting councils to join our campaign. The first one was in the Premier's seat, Georges River Council. And that's getting real traction because that gets their notice. Sandy Grant is the Dean of the Anglican Cathedral in Sydney. He has a wonderful way of putting it, a really helpful way. Back in the late 60s, early 70s, and I'm old enough to remember sitting in a bassinet, or sitting on the back seat of our Holden Kingswood with no seatbelt on. Remember before seatbelts were mandatory? Sliding across the vinyl seat. And we made seatbelts mandatory because of the avoidable, preventable harm that was causing through road accidents. So what Sandy says is, what we need for poker machines is airbags and seatbelts. Let's put seatbelts around, put airbags around. So we need elevating the story. When I shared, there were a number of stories that were shared this morning. When we talked to media, when we talked to community, tonight it was a different presentation. But the voices that speak loudest are the ones who have experienced harm. Elevating and empowering their voices, I think, is both astute politically, but it's also appropriate biblically. So I think that's a really important way. So grassroots, lived experience voices, these are the things that over time, and recognising, again to quote Martin Luther King, the arc of the universe bends towards justice, and it does take time. We've got some wins along the way, but the big wins will probably come long after I've finished as superintendent at Wesley Mission. It'll take time because it took us 70 years to get where we are now, but we have to persevere. Brant? Okay, yeah, thank you. Brian Polkinghorn.
Thanks, Stu. I really want to say thank you because of your passion, your compassion and your stickability at it. Being a Wilberforce in this day is significant.
Thank you.
Look, I want to thank also the moderator for picking this issue up and the Synod for picking this issue up as a significant issue, and I wish you every best issue as you go forward. This is a significant issue.
Thank you.
This week, H5N1 has arrived on our shore here, and we don't know the implications of that, but they will probably be fairly significant. I'm wondering if you know the answer to this question, has something equivalent like the H5N1 is it landing on the shores of the third world, the poor world, where they go for the profits here in Australia? What's the possibility of that landing on the shore of the third world? Gambling and destroying families and society.
Yeah. Well, it is landing. It is landing. If you're in developing nations, you know, Brian, that most people's lives are lived on their mobile device, and on those mobile devices are all the apps which are available anywhere, anytime around the world on anything. So, the devastation that's happening here, Australia still leads the pack. I mean, it's a terrible, terrible record, isn't it? That we actually lead the whole world when it comes to gambling losses. But many parts of the world tragically are catching up. And in real terms, in some of those poorer countries, the impact is even more profound. Because, algorithms, gaming technology manufacturers like Aristocrat, like our social media companies, the algorithms, and now, what terrifies me, if I'm frank, is AI-empowered gambling apps. They fine-tune their products to keep you on your phone or in front of the machine for longer, betting more. That's their business model. How do we keep the punter there for longer and putting more money in? That's how exploitative it is. So in the developing world, I think that's is something that is tragically having a really terrible impact. Brant.
Stewie.
Yep, Branty.
Have you talked to Pauline yet?
Yeah, that's a good question. No, it's a really good question, and we're trying to work out who in One Nation to talk to about this. I think there's a lot of advocates on a lot of issues are trying to work that out, and I think One Nation are trying to work out what their position is and who their person is to talk to. So we engage with everybody. You know, anyone who will lend us an ear, we will give them a mouthful of information and reasons why they should participate. So I was in Canberra just before Easter. I think over 36 hours, had 17 meetings with people from across all the parties, not just around gambling reform, but around other issues, but particularly around gambling reform. And when you talk to Labor politicians, they are embarrassed. They're embarrassed. They'll tell you privately they're embarrassed, but my hands are tied, caucus solidarity, yada, yada, yada. So if it sounds like I'm frustrated, because I am, you know, it was a Liberal Party in New South Wales that broke ranks and said we need to do something. It was a devoutly Catholic Premier who really went out on a limb, and it cost him. It didn't cost him electorally. Many in New South Wales would say it actually narrowed the gap between, it was a distinguishing thing. In this day, between the major parties, often there's not much that distinguishes them. This one actually did. And it helped. So, you know, I think, you know, as with any social reform, significant social reform, it needs to be a broad coalition. And there are voices right across the parties that all see that we need to do something. And I would hope and expect One Nation included.
Thank you for what you're doing. Sorry.
Yeah, go.
I was part of the workshops this afternoon, and the thing that struck me was we're all referring to the advertising campaigns that were very effective with seatbelts and alcohol and those sorts of things. I struggle to find a graphic image that's going to have the same effect as like the car crashes, the effects of car crashes and things like that. And maybe we all need to put our thinking caps on to find that image that's going to make that big impact.
Yeah, yeah, I think that's true. What cuts through in our attention-distracted world, it needs to be the images, the voices, the words, the phrases that get the cut through. I mean, I use the seatbelts and airbags thing all the time because it gets cut through. Public health catastrophe. In an outrage, addicted media landscape, we have to walk a fine line between dropping into that outrage but also making sure that our voice is not crowded out. It's a fine line. Because there's plenty to be outraged about when it comes to gambling.
I was recently asked to participate in an art exhibition with the theme Light and Wonder. I wanted some inspiration, so
It's a gaming technology manufacturer.
The first 100 images on Google, only 3 were not of that company's logo.
A gaming technology company called Light and Wonder.
Do you have any stats or information about what proportion of the money that's raised from gambling is going to these companies versus into the hands of the pub barons and the the government?
It's an unvirtuous cycle. So they have some of the most sophisticated programming. They have clinical psychologists, neurologists on their payroll, all of this coming together to perfect their product. And they know they have a product that they can convince pubs and clubs is going to keep people there longer, spending more, that they'll sell more of that product. So it's one of our great export industries here in Australia is gaming machine technology. So we export, we're one of the biggest manufacturers of poker machines in the world. We actually export them to Las Vegas. Yeah, we do. So Aristocrat is, it's a publicly listed company that's worth many billions of dollars. I can't remember what it last was. That would be the biggest of them. So I look at it, there's a unvirtuous cycle between the gaming technology manufacturers. And on the independent panel I was on, and again I'm under an NDA so I can't say too much, those gaming technology manufacturers, they're providing the technology for cashless gambling to Crown Casino. 500,000 people have signed up. If you go to Crown Casino in Melbourne, you can't use cash. You have to give your identity, there's breaks in play, all of those things. And they're saying, what they can do in Melbourne, we can't do that in New South Wales. We don't have the technology. I mean, it's just a lie. So, because they want to protect because they know, because Crown Casino have experienced this, they have seen a significant drop in revenue on their poker machines when people have carded play, because they can set loss limits. They have breaks in play, which are just mandated. All of those things which we want to see put in there. Yeah. Last two, perhaps. I'm just conscious of time.
Stuart, my name's Chris Thornton,
Hi,
Wimmera
Chris.
Presbytery, Narungga country. I worship and live on Narungga country, on the York Peninsula. I would like to suggest an image for what the gambling industry is doing to people, and that is parasites. You can
Ticks.
think of
I think it was on ticks.
That's possible. We don't have so many of those here, but you can get some horrible, horrible images of what parasites do to people and animals. And if you can tie those to all the people who are exploiting and sucking the lives out of people through gambling, and making themselves huge and wealthy in the process, I think maybe that might work.
Yeah, well, it is a parasitic industry, no question. Thank you. Last one.
Hi, Stu. Good to see
Hey,
you.
David.
What struck me tonight is it's basically, I've often thought with domestic violence, it's pretty much one household in 4. And with gambling harm, it's pretty much one household in 5. And I was wondering if you could, it's a stats question, because obviously the harm per household or harm per individual, that's I think you've touched a bit on productivity. That's an economic drain. At the same time, the nation is needing a whole lot of people to do work. There's a whole debate about migration. Are there any stats which sort of tell the story about almost the economic growth potential by reducing harm?
Absolutely.
Yeah, could you just unpack that fraction?
There was a study done here in South Australia, for example. So the lineup of groups, so the state-based and federal productivity commission, crime commissioners, treasuries, all have said gambling is a highly unproductive economically industry. So, for example, I can't remember exactly, it was actually a South Australian study, you can Google it later, you'll find it. But for for a pub, every dollar, say every $100 that is, basically the multiplier in a pub of hospitality is 5 or 6 times jobs as in a poker machine venue, every dollar of revenue. So in other words, far more jobs are generated by a schnitty and chips than by a poker machine venue. So there's more jobs. It's better for the economy. People are earning money, which they're then spending, the multiplier impact of that, rather than going, and this is where it's going. One of the reasons that pubs have become these incredibly lucrative pieces of real estate is not because, Cabramatta pub is worth tens of millions of dollars, not because it's in a salubrious part of Sydney, because it has 30 poker machines that earn $20 million gross profit a year. So that's where the money's going. So it's incredibly unproductive when it comes to the jobs economy, when it comes to the economy generally. And there's bucket loads of research. One of the things about Australia being the gambling capital of the world, we're the gambling research capital of the world. So we have all the evidence. What we don't have is the political will and courage to actually do something. And that's where we have to bring our voice, to make it unpalatable for politicians to do nothing, which they've been able to do for so long. This has to be the last one.
That conversation put in mind to me gross domestic product and wondering how these numbers that you've been speaking of, Stu, get reflected in our gross domestic product. Now, my knowledge about that is because son number 2 is the person in Canberra who produces the reports on gross domestic product. And there are all sorts of things that get brought to book in that calculation. But is that another way of coming in on the leverage front?
Yeah, maybe. And I'm the first one up. When I hear the word, the acronym GDP, it warms the cockles of this recovering accountant's heart. So I love all of that, but I've had to learn along the way that as much as I might like stats and numbers, it's stories, it's impact, One of the tragic things, and David, I thought you was where you were going with your question, but the links, there's been a couple of really significant research reports released in the last 6 months around the connections, the correlation between gambling harm and domestic and family violence. It's horrendous. So, in New South Wales, when state of origin happens, it is big. It is big. And the combination of alcohol and gambling is devastating for women and children. We see spikes, and we operate domestic and family violence services, also Lifeline. There is a demonstrable spike in statistics around state of origin, and it's down to the deadly combination of alcohol and gambling and the losses that are caused. So women and children wear the brunt more often than not. There's a cheery note to finish on.
Brian Polkinghorne gave me credit which I can't take a lot of. One, the inspiration to have Stu with us was just as much our General Secretary, Philip Gardner, and I got the privilege of inviting, but it's been very much a team effort to have Stu here. But it's also people like Brian who took PAC, Prince Alfred College, to task over the use of Gillum McLaughlin. Was Gillum? Yep. Yes, that's another one coming up. But it was people like Brian Polkinghorne advocating with one of our lead schools, and then getting Tim Costello to come and speak. Can I ask the members of those who are part of the Justice, Mission and Theology Management Group to stand? So Mark Waters, Director of Uniting Care, Paul Turley, who has both a Presbyterian congregation role, Jenny Hughes, Executive Officer, Mission Resourcing, Scott Litchfield, Mission Activator and Uniting Communities role, Krista McGaw, just wondering what's next, but these are the people that are actually, Paul Go, I was just intentionally missing the President-elect, who is a mission activator. Just stay standing. Now, anyone else who's also attended one of the Justice, Mission and Theology subcommittee events? Yes, stand. If you've been to one, so this is actually the broad group of people who are taking to heart a number of justice issues. So it's not just the moderator, it's actually broadly a broad voice. And I'm actually more proud that we have such a group, and there are more people who are not here in this room, a part of that network. So it's something that we are working on, something that we've got a long way to go on. Stu was also showing a paper this morning, which I think I need a copy of, was the paper from the heads of churches in 1999 on gambling reform. Yep. So we need to revive that. So we are so well resourced, and thank you everyone. And the fact that you've all come out, thanks President-elect, you can sit now. For members of Synod who have stayed around, for those who have given up other things that they might have been doing on a Friday night. Before I pray, Stu, we do want to offer you a gift. It is, both parts of this gift are locally made. It's probably helped the local economy, and it has nothing to do with the gambling industry.
I'm hoping it's AIDS related.
Well, keep hoping. No. Let us pray. God, unlike those of the Clapham sect and other spiritual giants, sometimes we find our words inadequate. They lack even the nuance. But our hearts break. Our spirits sometimes feel as though they've been dulled by the onslaught And yet we have been reminded, our God, that you are the God of all creation, that it is you, your Son, Jesus Christ, our Lord and Saviour, crucified, risen, resurrected Christ in our midst, and that we can and will act in your name by your power. Lord, we do pray for your continued provision, your inspiration, your protection for Stu and his team, for Stu and his family. May they know your grace and your mercy continually. Lord, when they feel empty, fill them. When they are weary, re-energise them. Grant them this time and the space for rest. We give thanks for Stu's passion, for the hope, the belief, the optimism in this room now and across your church. We seek your blessing as we continue this evening and go for rest ourselves, that we may be renewed, we are challenged, and we will turn up again for the business of this synod. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. Go in peace. And once again, Stu, we are so blessed. Thank you for coming, spending your time with us, and we may part ways over the state of origin.
No crows.
that is not one of your best friends a Port supporter? Yeah. So thank you one and all. Rest well tonight, and members of Synod, we look forward to seeing you for the beginning of the session with worship and Bible study at 9 a.m. tomorrow morning.